Welcome to Disability Empowerment Now, Season 4. I'm your host, Keith Murphy Digincini. Today I'm talking to Erik Fuhrer, PhD, a teacher and poet. Erik, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
How did you find out about the podcast?
I had a friend of mine, Liz, had been on your podcast in this season as well. And then I started checking out the other episodes in your Instagram. So yeah, that's how I found out about it.
And what kind of poetry do you write? And what led you to being a teacher, a trauma transformation coach, a memoirist? Is there anything you don't do, Erik? Let's start there. But no, you're obviously a very creative individual. I can see how you know Liz now. And so, what was the genesis spark that unleashed your creativity?
Yeah, I mean, currently I've been writing a lot about trauma. It's my poetry has kind of changed. So when I first started writing, I feel like there were things I wanted to write about, but I feel like maybe I don't know if I was conscious of this, but I think I wanted to have distance from certain things that I wanted to write about. So my poetry started off kind of abstract and kind of a lot of images that were kind of abstract. And then I would say over the last 3 years or so, I've started thinking a little bit more about trauma, which I think is kind of why I wanted to always write in the first place, because I had something to say about things that have happened to me, but I feel like that was so difficult to do for very long. But once I started writing, I feel like, yeah, over the last 3 years, it was strangely right when the pandemic happened. And
Wonderful time to get started in this whole new venture while the world is upside down, literally.
yeah, I felt like I had just gotten out of a stay at the hospital, and I think I was thinking a lot about my mental health at the moment, and I was just um, I just had a lot of time, and it was literally when I got out of the hospital, like COVID, the first wave of COVID, like that's when it really hit. And we were all in isolation at that time. And I was currently between jobs. So I just started kind of diving into, actually, I started diving into watching a lot of Buffy the Vampire Slayer, right? Which I didn't.
We'll get into that later, but uh,
Oh,
yeah, that's that came up in episode 2 of the season. If you go back and listen uh, to that, and this is where they're linked. That's a wonderful episode, and I don't really talk about previous episodes during episode, but since we're gonna be talking about Buffy the Vampire, the second episode is with a wonderful poet from Long Island called Liv Marone.
mhm.
And she does a lot. She's very involved with Buffy the Vampire and exploring that from a disability lens, trauma lens. she's a wonderful poet in person, and so that's uh, the linkage that I was gonna make later on in the episode. But since we're here, I keep hearing about Buffy the Vampire, and I often miss fads of fandoms while they're happening, and I did get into the spin-off show Angel because
Mhm.
I really like the lead actor, and I liked the more emphasis on noir and loneliness and grittiness. That's where I was. I mean, had I gotten into Buffy the Vampire Slayer when it was on, pardon that it would be to watch Sarah Michelle Gellar be eye candy. I hate to say that, but as a teenager, that's exactly where I was. Um, which is why I never got into it as a teenager. But I hear about it more and more now, and it's been off the air for quite a while. Uh, let's go into that. Why why do you think the fandom of that show in particular is so rampant and keeps the show and the universe alive?
Yeah, for me it was like after I got out of the hospital it was COVID and I was just trying. I loved the show, right? So I think I was just trying to watch it and kind of get pleasure from that, right? But
I
I
also, sorry, I at that time I also was into the vampire supernatural take. Uh, that came later, and Angel really helped with that. But go on.
yeah, so I think I was just trying to just have, just kind of have distance and just watch a show. But as I was watching it for the first time, at that moment, I started noticing a lot of the trauma in it. And I started feeling very different about my relationship with the show. And that kind of started me writing a line towards Buffy. I just wrote something. And all of a sudden, I started writing about my trauma. And all of a sudden, I was able to kind of unlock these things that I never felt comfortable talking about or like was trying to get distance from my whole life. And whenever I tried to write about the trauma head on, it never worked. And then all of a sudden, I wrote this line to Buffy after I started noticing kind of connections in some way. And all of a sudden, I was able to talk about this. And then for me, there's I'm not exactly sure what it is, but I was surprised because I didn't realize I had that connection with the show. But it did open all these floodgates. And then I started watching all of her other work, and it continued to open these floodgates. And I didn't realize, I knew I liked her work. I'd seen it when I was younger. And kind of, I grew up with her work a lot. And I know I loved I Know What You Did Last Summer, but all of a sudden, I Know What You Did Last Summer was starting to feel like my Casablanca kind of. It was like really, really, really affecting me. And I was like crying when I was watching this movie that I know is camp and I know it was a teenage movie. And when I watched it when I was younger, I did not, I don't remember having those feelings, but watching it now, it was all hitting very differently. And it was all having me go back to internal things in my life and traumas in my life. And in the books I've written, the recent books, I was able to the books interact with her work a little bit. Like in Gellar Studies, the poetry book I published last year, it interacts with her work, but it's not about her work really. It's more about my relationship watching her work. So more about like how when I watched these characters, somehow they enabled me to both have distance, but then also explore things in my life that kind of resonated in some way with me. So it's almost like my viewing journey a little bit, but um, they really were like, it was almost able to get me distance from writing about my trauma. So it was almost like Buffy was almost a buffer, I keep saying, um, for thinking through things that were way too painful to talk about. And then I was able to talk about them in more straightforward ways. But I still needed for myself that kind of um, displacement a little bit, where I was able to look towards her work and talk about her work and then pivot back into mine. And that felt more authentic and comfortable. And I was able to talk about all these things that I was never comfortable talking about before.
Thank you for that detailed answer. Why do you think the show remains as popular as it is, despite being off the air for I don't know how many years, and there was a not well received movie that I think predated it. And but that series made the careers of a lot of its cats. Uh, and so, why do you think the show still resonates as deeply as it does?
Yeah, I remember reading something by Chana Mieville one time where he said that when he watched Buffy, he felt like he was in Buffy and like these people were his friends. And I remember him feeling weird about that, right? But I think um, there's something true to that. There's something about the show that, at least for me, feels very relatable. And I think one of the reasons, because it's that show, but it's also all of her work for me, but that show in particular, I feel like there's such a close-knit friend network in that show. And
Yeah,
it just feels like something I didn't have, right? At that time. And
yeah,
I
yeah,
feel like watching it makes me feel, this is going to sound really weird, but it makes me feel protected in some way, right? Because there is, like, in that world, there is such this strong friend network that really sustains her and all of the other characters. And then,
Oh,
um,
absolutely. She would be nowhere without that network of friends, advisors, frenemies that turn into lovers and then back to frenemies. And the fanfic community is massive. Fandoms in general, if you just think about Star Trek, Star Wars, Doctor Who,
mhm,
Supernatural, Buffy the Vampire, on and on and on. Fandoms are very impressive, but can be very aggressive as well. Uh, no judgment. It's just telling it like it is. So let's get more into your work
mhm,
and how you decided to offer trauma transformation coaching, because that was the first thing on your website that caught my eye because I have never really heard about that in depth and been able to talk to a coach about what they do, the complications, the highs and lows, what they get out of it, what they bring to it. And so, yeah, talk about that.
Yeah, so the coaching is something I'm still developing, and I'm teaching currently in the next quarter a course at UCLA that's on writing trauma, and the impetus behind me wanting to do it was was my process and how I came to it, right? Like that I wanted to write about this for so long, and then what? It took me over 30 years to finally feel comfortable writing it or I don't want to say comfortable, finally feeling like I had a way to express it, right? Because whenever I tried to hit it head on and just write pure memoir or just write those moments, it was kind of re-traumatizing. It wasn't healthy for me. And I wasn't able to do it. And I got kind of too um, caught up and everything. And I think, there were so many different ways to write trauma. So one of the things that really resonates for me is Buffy and Sarah Michelle Gellar, and then other pop culture too. Pop culture, for some reason, is something that really helps me process my own life, and I think it's
Yeah.
because pop culture often feels like an escape from things, or it can be an escape from
Yes,
things. Uh,
yes, it definitely can.
And then for me, a lot of pop culture is an escape, but then it also like pulls me back in and feels, like I said, like resonates with me, like Buffy did, right?
I
So
think there's also, speaking of pop culture, the nostalgic factor of Buffy and Angel. Uh, I mean, they were filmed and released at a very different time, technology wise. And culture wise than we find ourselves in now. So, but a show or work can't or shouldn't run on the nostalgic factor alone. And I don't think either Buffy or Angel does that. It's just that's another hook of the escapism of being transported in and out of those shows and the different motifs and analogies, metaphors, etc., etc.
yeah, I think the nostalgia thing is really important to me. I think it brings me to most of the pop culture that influences me and that helps me write is pop culture from when I was like a teen. And I think that's because um, at that time I needed that. And I like when I was a child and a teen, and I think I needed that kind of escape. And now when I look back at that stuff that might have been an escape for me back then, now stuff like Buffy or Sarah Michelle Gellar's work, which were escapes, now hit me differently and feel more like they're speaking to me in different ways, and help me process it. So yeah, there is a lot about the nostalgic factor, and especially where I was at that time when I was watching it. And I guess I didn't realize, how important those texts really were to some kind of formative moment for me. And just going back to them now, I start to. And with the coaching, I feel like I want to help people do that, right? So it's so hard to know, like the most, like kind of most kind of, I don't want to say natural way, but the way that I always went when I wanted to write about trauma was to write about the trauma, right? And that's so difficult to do. And to try to help people find their own Buffys, right? Or their own Sarah Michelle Gellars, or their own pop culture, their own ways that will help them write through these moments that might not be writing about them head on, right? Maybe they're never going to be, maybe the way for them to process and the way for them to kind of think through and write through it is to write a novel about robots, right? Is to write something that, is able to somehow express that trauma in metaphor, like you were talking about, like Buffy does really well. And in metaphor, in horror movies are all about trauma a lot, right? And because they're kind of taking these moments and then making them different, right? And that, I want to help people do that. I want to help people think about, okay, I need to process this in some way. I want to write
Yeah,
about this, but maybe I don't have to write about that moment, right?
yeah,
Maybe I can take this feeling, this emotion, and write a fantasy novel, write a book of poetry, write a horror novel, write a horror screenplay, create a superhero, right? Not all superheroes, but a lot of superheroes, their manifestation is through trauma, right?
yeah.
And there is, I have no idea if the people who created these superheroes were processing trauma on their own, but it certainly is a way that they could have been, right?
Yeah,
To
I mean that, man, do you need a clear example of superhero through trauma or because of trauma?
yeah, yeah.
Yeah,
A lot of them had their burgeoning as a hero came from this really, really like traumatic core
yeah.
moment.
So talk, you have a new book coming out next year that I think it's very relatable to the discussion we're having and have been having. Would you tell us about that?
Yeah, so it's called My Buffed Up Life, right? And from that, this is coming from the writing that I started that I was talking about before, like during the first wave of the pandemic. Um, it's coming from that writing, that line I wrote to Buffy. I wrote a line, and all of a sudden I was able to write about things I never could write about before. And writing this book, again, using Buffy as kind of a buffer, I was able to write about these moments and then kind of have these fictional asides to Buffy throughout the text, in which I kind of correspond with her and think through moments from her life and the show that I see kind of resonances with in my own life. And then I can move back into mine. So the book includes letters to Buffy, like fictionalized letters to Buffy, where I write to her and kind of process that way. It includes, moments of just memoir from my life where I'm talking about traumatic moments from my childhood. And usually when I'm talking about that traumatic moments, there are times when, almost in every time, when I will pull back a second and fictionally kind of speak to Buffy and then pull back in. And it's almost like someone described it, and I think it was a good description, as kind of like she was like my Virgil through like the Inferno, kind of being able to kind of pull me through. And I think that's kind of how she functioned. And I find it interesting. I wasn't even thinking about that at all when I started writing it, but it's interesting how like that trope of like this guide that like brings you through is very present in there and does
Yeah,
kind of feel like it's patterned on stuff like Inferno, even though it's not, even though it wasn't consciously, I guess, right? So I find that really interesting. But so the book is it's written in a screenplay format. And I started writing a book of poems, and then it just didn't feel like it was working. I had a book of poems and then a bunch of little flash fictions, nonfictions, and I didn't really know what to do with it, and it felt kind of messy. And then I decided, since I was writing influenced by Buffy, why not try to make it feel more like a screenplay, something written for the visual? And then when I started doing that, it's not an actual screenplay because
Yeah.
it's kind of it would be impossible to film because a lot of it's just really really visual in ways
Yeah.
that just didn't work. But being able to think about it in the visual format really really helped me. And then I have some spells in there as well, and it just really it's again a memoir, but there's a lot of times when I will speak directly to the character of Buffy because that character did function kind of as this like guide towards bringing me through these traumatic moments.
So, what is it like to be a teacher on writing through trauma and also exploring your own and wanting to become a trauma transformational coach? How, where's the different intersections of those three activities, and where do they merge and where do they diverge from each other?
Yeah, so as a teacher, what was always very important to me is helping people not just read. Sorry, I taught English for a while, not just read text and think about text, but think about their lives and how it relates to the text, right? And really kind of think about their identities and their and why they're reading, what they're getting out of it, and how that's in a way transforming their life or could transform their life, right? Like, what could I take from this text that is going to help me think more deeply about who I am and what I'm doing in the world. Um, and so I always wanted, for literature for me, I always wanted literature and teaching, I always wanted students to be able to have these moments where they're always becoming more of themselves or differently as themselves or just discovering more things about themselves through what they're reading. And then so the writing trauma course that I'm doing again was a way to I want to provide space for people to have the kind of epiphany, the word I'm looking for, I'm not sure, but kind of like the epiphanies that I had, right? Where there was a moment where I just said, oh my God, I'm writing about this now. And Buffy took me there, and I was not sure what to do with that, but I went with it. And then Sarah Michelle Gellar's other work started taking me there, and I went with that. And to try to help other people find what that is for them, right? It might not be pop culture at all. It might be, you know, something, it might be the environment, hiking, it might be something completely different, but to find what that is and to find what that is for them to have that buffer, that processing to be able to talk about it. So that was really important to me. So the class that I'm teaching, it's important to me for each class for us to have different avenues of coming in, right? So I'm going to have each class have some memoir, have some interviews, and then we're going to look at some film clips, some songs, some music videos. And I want to have some things that are not just straight memoir, right? So that are like one thing I was thinking of. Have you seen the show WandaVision?
Yes.
There's that show kind of wrecked me when I watched it. I loved it. It was beautiful and it's haunting and it was one of the best shows I've seen recently. And that's that's a way that I think, it's fantasy, it's a
Yeah.
superhero, right? But it delves so deeply into trauma, but not,
Yep.
a personal trauma of anybody who wrote it, right? But through a
Yeah.
trauma of a character. So
Yeah.
again, I don't know whoever wrote that was processing any trauma. I have no idea, but I think it's possible, like if you are through a character like that, to be able
Yeah.
to place it from yourself, right? And
Yeah.
still deal with that emotions and still um, deal with, the content in a way,
Yeah.
especially the emotions that are like produced by that content. Um, and to have it be in this fictional world, but the just like again, the emotions is just so real and raw in that show, even though it is this wildly fictional place, right? So the class, that's what I want to offer people different ways for thinking about, okay, there's something I want to write about. What are different ways I could kind of try out to see what feels most authentic to me, and to see what, pathway would be most authentic and help me to write these things that I want to write. Because I think my first impulse, and most people's first impulse, is just to write about the trauma straight on, and that can be dangerous, right? It can be really
Yeah.
re-traumatizing. It can, because all you're thinking of is what happened to you, and that's not always healthy, right? But being able to like hold on to some of those things and hold on to some of their emotions and then translate that through
Yeah.
something else can be really powerful. So I want to offer people those opportunities, and the same thing in the coaching, and that would be more of a individualized experience in which we talk about these things together. We do writing exercises and try to think about what their stories, their emotions, their experiences are, and then what is the best way to express this? Like, what is the
Yeah.
best? Because writing trauma is also like about the craft of writing too, right? Like, how do we take these things and move them out? So it is healing in a way too, but it also is about thinking through craft. So like, how do we produce these things? What does that look like? And how can it be safe for us and also transformative in some way?
What did you like being a teacher on this subject? You talked uh, about the class and what you want your students to get out of it. It's a very interesting concept, a very deep, deep concept. And how do you prepare, or how are you preparing to go into teaching that?
That's a great question. Yeah, I mean, it's such so this is going to be a larger lecture class, it's going to be 50 students. So this is through UCLA's creative writing program, but it's going to be a no writing workshops. And I think that's good for a course like this because when you're writing such sensitive things, that might not be something you want to workshop, at least not right now, not right away. So the way I'm thinking about it is we're going to, again, look at different types of text so people can try out writing straight memoir if they want to, or they can try out writing something more metaphorical. We'll look at some, ways that horror is able to move through this. We'll look at WandaVision, we'll look at Stranger Things, right? Ways that the supernatural is able to be a vehicle towards having some distance, but also expressing these emotions. And then having time during the class for people to write their own stuff and try these different modes out, and then share if they want to, right? And then there's also going to be, the opportunity to have me look over some of their work as well. But in class, I want people to be writing. We're going to have prompts, but the prompts are going to be choices, so they get to choose kind of the avenue they want to take or the type of risk, because it is a risk, right? So the type of risk that
Yeah,
they want to take, is it going to be something straight on that they want to create a character and kind of write through that character, right? And there's going to be different options so that they can try to start thinking through their comfort and thinking through like balancing comfort and risk, right? And then if people want to share, we'll have space for people to share. So it'll be a little bit more like a co-writing workshop at times, right? In which we're all writing together and that all have space to express and talk about what we wrote. And they can talk about what they wrote instead of reading it. So having distance from the traditional writing workshop as well, so that it could be a sharing, it could be a talking about what they wrote instead of sharing that exact piece, and the just navigating and kind of thinking through, because it's very vulnerable, right? So being able
yeah,
to have have more kind of low stakes ways for that vulnerability to be shared if the person feels like sharing it.
I
Because I want, sorry.
no, I didn't mean to cut you off. Continue.
So I want people to feel empowered to share, and I want people to feel empowered to discover and to take these risks and to start thinking through ways that they can start writing through things that might feel difficult. But I also want to, you know, understand that not everybody empowerment looks different for every person,
Yeah,
right? So
it does.
empowerment is not going to look like sharing to everybody, right? For empowerment, just getting that thing down on the page is part of what that some people need, right?
Yeah.
So just again having the opportunity, but not just making sure that people know that it's a safe space where that thing on the page can just stay on the page with them if that's what feels more comfortable for them at that moment.
So I should have asked that at the beginning of the episode, but what did you get your PhD in?
In creative writing.
I knew that. I just had to get it in for the episode. I'm gonna ask probably the easiest question, the easiest layup question of this episode. What got you into creative writing? And why did you pursue a doctorate out of all the subjects you could choose for a doctorate? Why creative writing?
I feel like there's a lot of freedom in it, right? And there's a lot of freedom to kind of explore because through a creative writing doctorate, you're kind of writing your own stuff. And then you're also thinking about what you're writing into and the world you're writing into and the literature you're writing into and the tradition that you're writing into, right? So before I talked about how I recognize that my own narrative kind of mimics a trope that started with Dante, right? So thinking through that, right? So having time to write your own work and then having time to think about, like I said, I like doing with my students, right? Like, why am I doing this? Why am I writing this? And like like how does this shape me as a person, but how does it shape me as a person in the world with these other things in it, and how do I fit into this world, and who am I in conversation with, even if I didn't know I was in conversation with them, right? That's the most exciting thing, when you start realizing, oh, I'm doing this and I feel like this author is really influencing me. Let me look at their work a little bit more. And you start realizing and recognizing these connections, right? Which is something that I started realizing and recognizing when I was writing these two books, right? I started realizing, oh wow, Sarah Michelle Gellar is not just a actor who I love, but her work somehow really is deeply embedded into my experience of being a person in some way, and to having these experiences, and her work as a way for me to process this, and that's not something I ever knew before. So that's really exciting for me about creative writing, because we're creating these things that are all from our own, all us, right? Like me, it was all stuff coming from me, but it's not coming from me only, right? I'm deeply embedded in all these other experiences and works and histories, and it's exciting to be able to you know think about my own work and then also think about those networks. And that's what the PhD in creative writing really enabled me to do, is to do both of those things at the same time.
Have you ever met Sarah Michelle Gellar? Or if you did, what do you imagine that experience would be like?
Yeah, I haven't, but I would want something authentic, right? So like I never really I don't go to like Comic Cons or anything. I'm sure I would like that, but like my relationships with these fandoms of these pop culture
Yeah.
kind of it's very personal, right? And
Yeah.
if you read Gellar Studies, it's about her work, but you might not recognize, besides me telling you what work I'm talking about. Otherwise, it might not always be recognizable what work I'm talking about because it's such a personal connection I have to a character, and it's such a way that that character enables something in my own life for me to think through something. So it's really about how her stuff kind of activated, how her work kind of activated, just narratives of my own and how those connect. So I would love to have like an actual like authentic conversation with her where we just talk about things, right? Because it's and I would want her to know like how resonant her work was for me and how it was not just an entertainment, but it was a way for me to deeply process and learn a lot more about who I am and these experiences I went through. And for whatever reason, I don't know if I could really put my finger on it, but for whatever reason, her work unlocked that for me.
I
Yeah.
think she would appreciate that. In fact, I think a lot of actors or entertainers would appreciate that, to know that their work, and by entertainers, I mean actors, musicians, Broadway stars, uh, etc., etc., would like to know that their work transcends just the typical, and I hate using that word, pop culture fluff. Again, I'm not trying to besmirch any fandom. It's just that would be the entertainer's dream of hearing that their work has touched you in not the obsessive fan way, but to as a motif to unlock parts within yourself. And yeah,
Yeah, because I certainly appreciate and in many ways I'm part of like that fandom, right? But
yeah,
for a lot of it is just I feel outside of it a lot too, right? Because like it wasn't like it was one line to Buffy that I wrote, and all of a sudden it resonated with myself. And then I was writing all this like stuff that was locked away inside of me for so long, and so it was such this. It was again like this like personal connection that it was really about exploring who I am and things that I wanted to get out for so long. And that work unlocks. So as much as I like appreciate and I am in some ways part of that fandom, it's her work is just it does feel more Virgil-y to me, right? It does feel like I know you did last summer Buffy, and Cruel Intentions. For whatever reason, I love those
yeah,
films, but watching it again, it went beyond that, and it went to this place that really started being this life raft for me in some way.
yeah.
Uh,
I think, sorry to interrupt, I think if you take Gellar's walk in Buffy and contrast it with her comedic walk in The Crazy Ones
uh,
with Robin Williams, which REP, but RIP, sorry. Uh, I wish that got another season or two, because that was comedy freaking gold right there. The whole cast, felt like they were tailor-made for those roles in their careers. And so if you look at the beginning, which is Buffy to that point, and her career obviously didn't stop after that role, but if you just compare and contrast those two roles, that's a fascinating comparison right there. But I'm sorry, what were you saying?
Well, one, I love that you've seen the crazy ones. I normally don't meet people who have, and I do like that show a lot. And for me, I love all of her work, and I think she's a great comedic actor, and I think that I love Crazy Ones, and I think she does a really good job at that.
I mean, just the title and
Mm.
how that weaves throughout all the episodes. I'm like, I compare it to the remake of The Odd Couple with
Mm.
Matthew Perry, and I forget the other guy's name, but it, I love the oddball, odd, uh, but real life stuff that
Mm.
happens in both of those shows that people might and often do take for granted because it's just life. Characters are living their lives, going through makeups and breakups, job promotions, job losses, family issues. Uh, People respond to hearing about other people's real everyday lives. They do not respond in such a way to the glamorous of the fronts we put out in social media and all of that. Again, I'm not trying to bash those things, but in terms of what people, what really sticks with people beyond the fantasies of Lord of the Rings, Star Wars, etc., etc., all the real life stories that really pull people in and that they gravitate towards.
Yeah, and I think that is probably one of the reasons her work works so well for me, is because of her comedic tone and everything. All of her stuff is very campy, right? She doesn't very often do anything super serious, right? It's there are serious elements. Buffy has serious elements. All of her stuff, a lot of her stuff does, but it's always a little campy. Always has some comedy hit through it, and it always feels like it is thinking through a real person, right? Or
Yeah.
something that, and I think that's why I find such connection to it. And I think because that she's able to portray that so well, and because it's never gets too dark, right? And it never gets too it's always kind of cut with campiness, cut with some kind of humor. I find that really easy to enter, relate to, and then safe to kind of engage with, right? To think through my own work. So I think that's one of the reasons why her work resonates so much to me is like is what you said, you know.
So, in case there are any advocates listening who want to explore uh, traumatic, transformational writing, coaching, poetry, and really want to begin their path, what would be some advice, some action steps you would give them as they begin or continue on their journey?
Yeah. A lot of self-care, right? So I think, again, thinking through why you're thinking about writing this at the moment, and how it's like, yeah, like what your motivations are. Because I think the motivations have to be that this is something you need to write, right? Because if it's something that you feel like will help you, it might not, right? It could be re-traumatizing. It could be something that's negative, right? So it should be something that you feel this need and this drive to do and to explore. And as long as it's coming from a place like that, a place where this is something you know you need to do, and you don't feel like you have to do it the process, but it's something you need to do to process, then taking care, right? Then realizing that taking space is really important, right? I had to put this on hold for 30 years until I was able to write about it, right? And I'm not saying that, it's ever going to take that long for other people. We all have our own timelines, our own processes, right? But that, if you're not writing about it directly, that could be good, right? That could be part of writing about it, right? And
Yeah,
again, it can manifest in all these other ways. So maybe, to just start being more intentional about connections, right? So if you're not writing about your trauma, but all of a sudden you're writing this character who's going through some traumas, maybe you are writing about your trauma,
yeah.
right? You're just writing it a different way. And that's the way you need to process it. And that's the way you need to write about it, because that's the way that feels most, authentic and comfortable, and it gives you distance, but also gives you a way to process those emotions. So thinking about not necessarily processing the actual experiences,
Yeah.
but to process the kind of auras of those experiences, the um, emotions of those experiences, how those experiences resonate in your body and outside your body. And that can be really important. So even if you never write about the thing itself, um, it's still going to be productive, right? So thinking about taking care, taking self-care, and not writing things that feel uncomfortable. There's a certain amount of discomfort you need to have, right? But if
Yeah.
you feel re-traumatized, if you feel like it's taking you to places that you don't want to be in, then stop, right? And start trying to think about, okay, if that's taking me these places and writing about it directly is taking me these places, what would it look like to create a character and then to have them go through things that are similar or go through things that have similar emotions, and to start thinking about different ways to navigate.
I like to think I like to think that both advocates with disabilities and those who have yet to discover and embrace their own disabilities listen and watch this program and groups within those groups. I'm not naive enough to think that each group takes away the same things from every episode. So, as my guests, what do you hope that advocates with disabilities take away from this episode? And what do you hope that those who have yet to discover or embrace their own disabilities take away from this episode?
Yeah, I think, going back to just the point of taking care and taking time, right? It takes time to process identity. It takes time to process, you know, um, experiences that you have moved through and that have been that you have had difficulty moving through, because of um, your identity. So I think that taking it, especially because, I'm talking about writing these experiences and writing identity and writing trauma and writing, things that you might still be navigating. So again, taking time, taking space, and then thinking about ways to process and think through experiences that might not center you, but still center your experiences and still center
Yeah.
your emotions and your identities, but maybe don't, you know, are memoir and are different.
So if anyone wants to find out more about you or reach out to you directly, what is the best way to do that?
Um, yeah, you could put my contact information, so people can email me. I'm on Instagram too. So you can find me there. Yeah, or if you put my website on, people can contact me through my website. I'd love to
What
help.
is the website and what is your Instagram handle?
Sure. The website is www.myname, Erik, and then a hyphen, Fuhrer.com. And my Instagram is at Erik, Erik, Fuhrer.
Erik, I want to thank you so much for coming on the show. When this episode is, I think your book will either already be out or almost out. So congratulations on that release in advance. And I do hope you will keep in touch and come back so we can talk more.
Yeah, thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. Take care.
You too.